We try to tell them that it's basically the path of how a Muslim can practice their faith. And we explain to them that it's an evolving ideology. It's a ideology based on different interpretations that some Muslims agree with, some Muslims disagree with and have their own interpretations. That it's very different based on where you are, what time frame you are, and that it's ultimately, I always mention that ultimately one of the mandates of Sharia is that a Muslim respect the law of the land. So as Oklahoma Muslims, I'm actually mandated by Sharia to respect the laws of this state and this country. And that one is one of the largest obstacles we heard in the campaign, of course, to promote this anti-Sharia ban. That Sharia is inconsistent with Oklahoma law and the U.S. Constitution, when in fact Sharia specifically mandates Muslims respect the law of the land that they live in. There's not even an opportunity for conflict between the two. That as a Muslim, if certain aspects of Sharia conflict with the state law and U.S. law, I'm actually mandated as a Muslim to follow U.S. law and state law instead of following that aspect of my faith. And I think that's what I try to mention to help them understand it. And then oftentimes we try to relate it to the moral code or principles of other faiths. Help them understand that the exact same principles exist in the Christian community, in the Catholic community, in the Jewish community. These are code of ethics that Muslims follow on how to practice our faith and how to live our lives.
Yeah.
One, first and foremost, that Muslims are foreigners. This assumption that Muslims have come to Oklahoma to enforce some type of foreign law on the state of Oklahoma. You have tens of thousands of Oklahoma Muslims. I mean, Oklahoma Muslims have become a part of this society, a part of this community. The next generation of born and raised Oklahoma Muslims, one of the oldest African-American Muslim communities in America, is actually located in Oklahoma City. So one was this perception that Muslims are foreigners, they're bringing some type of foreign law to the state of Oklahoma. Two, that Islam and Sharia were somehow inherently evil and dangerous, that people who believed in Islam were much more prone to violence than someone that believes in any other faith, as if crime, the reason for crime in the Muslim community is because of their faith, where the reason for crime in other communities is obviously not because of their faith, because of some other criminal intent. That was the second thing. The third was sort of mixing and confusing the practices of terrorist organizations or repressive regimes overseas with Islam as a faith. So many times you would have these people argue that Sharia in Islam is about chopping off heads or chopping off hands. This is obviously not what Muslims believe in. Obviously different form of practice than what the faith actually is. So you would have people here pointing and saying, look at what happens in Saudi Arabia, that's Islam. Look at what happens in Iran. Look at what happens with the Taliban, that's Islam. Conveniently cherry picking sort of selective instances in, let's say, 3 countries, and assuming that that reflects what Islam as a faith is for the over 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. For Muslims that, and even ignoring the 57 majority Muslim countries around the world that don't engage in those same practices, and obviously ignoring the presence of the American Muslim community that has been law-abiding citizens in this country, in this state, and have coexisted and complied with the Constitution while practicing their faith. And I think maybe even a final point that was a part of misinformation is helping Oklahomans believe that somehow limiting the First Amendment rights of Muslims or limiting the constitutional protections for religious rights of Muslims was somehow legal in the state of Oklahoma. That if we get enough voters to go out there and vote against Muslims, that we can turn a law out of it. And I think even in our case, we battled with that a bit. In the last oral arguments at the appeals court, the attorney basically said what this precedent sets is that 50% plus one of any state can ban any religious community from practicing their faith in. Well, I always tell people, first and foremost, what I view as the largest change in our lives is that we would be living in a state that is enshrined in its constitution that Islam is unwelcome here, that Muslims are unwelcome here. So immediately we become citizens that don't have equal standing in our political community, not in our faith community, not in civic community. Muslims will be labeled in our Constitution as being inherently dangerous, and for that reason we have a specific law targeting only us to protect this state, which is absurd and obviously discriminating against Muslims in Oklahoma. Second, I say, again, you just look at my case initially and see we're filing a lawsuit based on my will. Muslims will no longer be able to have a will that reflects their faith and their faith traditions and how to devise their property upon their death. That's the case with our legal challenge. My will would become invalid in the state of Oklahoma. And we explain to Muslims that, and non-Muslims in the community, that my will reflects my faith but is totally legal. It's compliant to U.S. laws, compliant to the U.S. Constitution. The only reason it would become invalid is because it reflects my faith. So we always tell them, if you take a will that reflects Christian principles, and then you take my will, which reflects Muslim principles, if they do the exact same thing, only my will be invalid in the state of Oklahoma, only because it reflects Muslim principles, not because it does anything else that's illegal. But then we remind people that, again, you have the same problem that will come up with Muslim finance agreements. In Islam, interest is prohibited, so people that negotiate home mortgages or business contracts negotiate it in a way that eliminates interest for the sake of the religious tradition. Those documents that reflect religious traditions against interest would be prohibited and illegal in the state of Oklahoma. Then you have marriage contracts. Every Muslim that marries and has a religious institution in their state look over their marriage and their marriage contract and marriage agreement would be in jeopardy to having their marriage somewhat in limbo now, and asking the state to judge whether their spouse is entitled to certain benefits upon their death. Would they be considered a spouse in a Muslim marriage? You have Muslims that get married overseas and move to the United States, the immigrant community. Would their marriages be respected in the state of Oklahoma? For instance, what would happen if they wanted a divorce? What would the judge say in a divorce proceeding if he's not allowed to acknowledge that they were married in the first place? What would a judge say if one of them happened to move here and work with a state agency? That spouse died and his wife should be the benefit of anything in his retirement or anything with the contract with that state agency that gives benefits to her. Muslim families would not be able to prove that they're married to that person. And then you have the same thing that would come up with custody agreements upon divorce. Many religious communities have religious traditions and religious principles instituted in custody agreements, and a judge should be able to enforce that agreement. If this is between a Muslim couple, a judge would no longer be able to enforce that agreement because he's not allowed to consider Islam in the court of Oklahoma. So again, it touches on finances, it touches on business, it touches on family law, marriages, and it touches on wills. It touches on a number of things, and again, you always have that umbrella effect of basically demonizing the entire Muslim community, saying that Muslims are inherently dangerous to Oklahoma, and that's why we need to limit those rights.
So does the ban require then judges to look at the reasoning behind a certain agreement? Because, for example, if you were to draw up a mortgage agreement that did not include interest, would the judge then, I mean, I would think that a contract would still be a contract, but is this, what I hear you saying, would the ban then require the judge to say, well, it's a good contract, but because the reason for how they did things was related to Sharia law, then it would become void?
Well, for the example of business law, you would have a case where, say, the only time a contract will go before a court is if there was a breach of contract, if one party complains about what happened with the contract. So for a judge to understand whether there was a breach or not, they may be forced to ask for an expert to help clarify what the contract means. If you have an Islamic agreement or a finance agreement based on Islamic principles, and a judge is required to ask for some type of expert opinion, that would be prohibited in the state of Oklahoma. Again, this ban was written very broadly, and it specifically and explicitly explains that it's forbidden to consider Islam and to consider Sharia in Oklahoma courts. So even to consider it is banned in Oklahoma. So for instance, if we have a marriage contract, or in the case of my will, where I ask a judge to devise or probate my will based on a prophetic tradition in Islam, just that alone is enough to stop the court from probating my will. They're not allowed to investigate further to see what that tradition says. They're not allowed to investigate further to see how that tradition actually complies with U.S. or Oklahoma law. Just the mention of Islam is forbidden in Oklahoma courts. For instance, with the business agreement, a judge would not be allowed to ask an Islamic expert to help explain and define what the aspects of that contract are that are supposed to be compliant with their faith.
Yeah.
And again, what it does is it sets a atmosphere of uncertainty.
Yeah.
If I do have that business contract, again, I have that sort of sense of uncertainty. How would this play out in a court if there was a breach of contract?
Yeah.
If my business partner chose to breach the contract, is he doing it in confidence, knowing that I would not be able to bring it before a court in Oklahoma?